Hi, you are watching Revenge of Reddit.
The first time she noticed the camera, it was hidden inside a decorative clock in the living room. At first, she dismissed it. A paranoid thought, she told herself. Maybe her husband had installed it for security. Maybe she was imagining things. But when she leaned closer, when her fingers brushed against the cool metal rim and felt the unnatural seam around the lens, she knew. It was deliberate. It was watching her. Her name was Evelyn. 34 years old, a teacher, a mother, and until recently, a believer in the idea that love, even imperfect love, was worth fighting for. She met Nathan when she was 26. He was charming, confident, the kind of man who could make a crowded room feel small. He told her she was different, special, and for a time she believed it. But charm can rot into control, and confidence can become cruelty. The first signs were subtle. He'd criticize the way she folded laundry, correct her in front of friends with a laugh, ask where she was going, who she was seeing, and why. It felt protective at first, like love. But love does not leave bruises on your sense of self. Soon, her world became smaller, her voice quieter. And then, when their daughter Lily was born, the cage closed entirely. Nathan's family had never liked Evelyn. To them, she was an outsider, an interloper who had stolen their golden son. His mother, Eleanor, was particularly vicious. Polite smiles in public, poison in private. "Are you sure you're feeding the baby right?" she'd ask. "You seem tired." Maybe Nathan should take over more decisions. They treated Evelyn's anxiety after childbirth not as something human and understandable, but as evidence. Evidence that she was weak, unstable. The cameras appeared after Evelyn started questioning things, after she stopped apologizing for existing. At first, it was just the one in the clock, then another behind a bookshelf, one more disguised as a smoke detector in the hallway. They were everywhere, silently watching her cook, rock Lily to sleep, cry alone in the bathroom. When she confronted Nathan, he smiled. "You're imagining things?" he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "Maybe you should see someone about this paranoia." Gaslighting. The slow, deliberate erosion of her reality. She knew what she'd seen. She'd held one of the cameras in her hand. But when she showed it to Eleanor, the older woman clutched her pearls and said, "Oh, sweetheart, that's part of our security system. You really should relax." They began documenting her every word, twisting it into something it wasn't. A frustrated sigh became evidence of instability. A tearful breakdown, the result of months of psychological torture, was proof she was unfit to be a mother. And behind her back, they were building a case. Whispering to friends, doctors, even lawyers that Evelyn was losing her mind. The day she found the folder was the day she stopped being a victim. It was tucked away in Nathan's home office. A collection of printed screenshots, transcriptions, carefully edited clips of her worst moments. And at the top, Custody Strategy, Phase 1. They weren't just gaslighting her anymore. They were preparing to take Lily. For a week, Evelyn barely slept. Fear clawed at her ribs. If she told anyone, would they even believe her? Nathan was charming. Eleanor was respectable. They had money, lawyers, a reputation. She was just a mother, anxious, exhausted, and now branded unstable. But fear has a strange alchemy. It can turn into rage. And rage, when sharpened by love for a child, becomes something unstoppable. She started documenting everything. Every conversation, every insult, every manipulation. She bought her own hidden cameras. Not to spy, but to protect herself. And what she captured was worse than she ever imagined. Nathan and Eleanor discussing how to provoke a reaction. Nathan telling his sister to accidentally spill wine on Evelyn and film her response. Eleanor laughing about how judges never side with hysterical women. They were manufacturing madness, piece by piece. And soon Evelyn had the proof. She didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, she met with a lawyer. A woman named Mara, with ice in her veins and fire in her eyes. Mara listened silently as Evelyn explained everything. Then she leaned forward and said, "We're going to turn their game against them." It began with a restraining order, then a forensic sweep of the house, revealing 9 hidden recording devices, all illegally placed. A police report followed, and while Nathan's lawyers tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, the evidence spoke louder than any excuse. Evelyn's recordings, the ones she'd taken in secret, were handed over to investigators. And when the transcripts hit the courtroom, the facade cracked. The charm slipped. Nathan stammered. Eleanor's voice shook. The perfect family mask shattered under the weight of their own words. But Evelyn wasn't done. She filed a civil lawsuit for emotional abuse and unlawful surveillance. She exposed the smear campaign, the false medical reports Eleanor had tried to submit, the fabricated testimonies from Nathan's friends. And when the press got hold of the story, their perfect suburban reputation collapsed. It was a long war. Months of hearings, cross-examinations, whispered threats, and sleepless nights. But Evelyn had something they didn't: the truth. And she wielded it with surgical precision. In the end, the judge granted her full custody of Lily. Nathan was ordered to attend therapy and restricted to supervised visitation. Eleanor faced charges for evidence tampering. The family that once sought to destroy her now lived under the shadow of their own crimes. Evelyn never smiled when the verdict was read. Revenge, she'd learned, wasn't about satisfaction. It was about survival. And survival had remade her. No longer the quiet, apologetic woman they thought they could break, but a mother forged in fire. Yet even after victory, the scars remained. Sometimes she still woke up at night, certain there was a camera watching her. Sometimes she still questioned her own memories. But every time Lily ran into her arms, laughing and safe, Evelyn knew she'd done more than win a legal battle. She'd reclaimed her reality. And that, more than any verdict, was the truest form of justice. But stories like Evelyn's don't end neatly, because men like Nathan rarely accept defeat, and families like his never forgive humiliation. A month after the trial, a letter arrived in her mailbox. No return address, just a single sentence written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "We're not done." Evelyn read it once. Then she burned it. Because now she wasn't the prey. She was the storm. The first sign that they were still watching came 3 weeks later. Evelyn was leaving the grocery store with Lily when she noticed a familiar car idling at the far end of the parking lot. A dark blue sedan with tinted windows. It had been behind her twice that week. Once near Lily's daycare. Once near her lawyer's office. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe not. Her lawyer told her to report it, but Evelyn didn't. Not yet. She knew Nathan's family. They thrived on fear. They wanted her to panic, to lash out, to give them something they could use. But she was done reacting. This time, she would control the story. At home, she upgraded the security system. Cameras of her own. Legal, documented, time-stamped. A motion sensor alarm. A lawyer vetted notice on her door warning that trespassers would be prosecuted. Every move she made was deliberate, calculated. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was building a record. And then one night, the blue sedan vanished. In its place, an anonymous package appeared on her doorstep. Inside was a USB drive. No note, no explanation. Just files. Video files. They were clips of her, walking to her car, playing with Lily in the park, sitting in her therapist's office lobby. Hours of footage, some of it filmed from yards away, some of it from across the street, all without her knowledge. Someone had been following her for months. Evelyn took the drive straight to Mara. Her lawyer's jaw tightened as she watched the videos. "This is stalking," she said quietly. "It's harassment, and it's going to backfire." They went to the police again, this time with more than suspicion. An investigation was opened. The footage was traced back to a private investigator, one hired under a fake name, but paid from an account linked to Nathan's father's company. A restraining order became a criminal case. The courtroom was colder this time. Nathan didn't speak. Eleanor didn't look at her. Their lawyers argued that the surveillance was necessary to ensure Lily's safety. The judge disagreed. Evelyn won another round, but she understood now. They weren't trying to win legally. They were trying to exhaust her, to break her spirit piece by piece until she surrendered. And that realization changed everything. She stopped thinking like a victim and started thinking like a strategist. She began documenting not just what they did, but why. Every contact, every attempt, every subtle manipulation became part of a larger pattern. Gaslighting wasn't random. It was a calculated campaign. And if they wanted a war, she would fight it on her terms. She launched a blog under a pseudonym. At first, it was just an outlet, a place to pour her experiences into words. But the blog grew. Women from all over wrote to her. Teachers, doctors, stay-at-home mums. Their stories echoed hers. Hidden cameras, fabricated diagnoses, weaponized legal systems. A silent epidemic of psychological warfare waged in kitchens and courtrooms. The blog turned into a platform. The platform turned into a movement. Soon, journalists reached out. Advocacy groups. Even lawmakers. Evelyn became something she never intended. A voice. And with that voice came power. She began collaborating with lawyers who specialized in coercive control. Together, they drafted proposals for legal reform. Tighter penalties for unlawful surveillance, clearer protections in custody disputes, better training for judges. And when the first article about her case appeared, The Gaslight Trap, How One Woman Fought Back Against Domestic Manipulation, the narrative shifted. She wasn't a hysterical ex-wife. She was a whistleblower. Nathan hated that. He filed a defamation suit, accusing her of ruining his reputation. It was a mistake. During discovery, Mara's team gained access to his encrypted messages, hundreds of them. Messages detailing plans to fabricate psychiatric reports, to plant substances in Evelyn's home, even to bribe a social worker. The lawsuit collapsed. Nathan faced charges of conspiracy and perjury. And for the first time, Evelyn saw something in his eyes that had never been there before. Fear. But victory still didn't bring peace. Trauma doesn't disappear just because a judge says you've won. It lingers. In the corners of your mind, in the way you flinch when the phone rings, in the way you scan every room for hidden eyes. There were days Evelyn questioned whether the fight was worth it. Nights she sat awake, watching Lily sleep, wondering if the war had cost her more than it had saved. But then Lily would smile, unburdened and free, and Evelyn would remember why she started. The breaking point came during the final custody appeal. Nathan's lawyer stood before the court, his voice dripping with a false concern. "My client only wants what's best for the child," he said. "Mrs. Carter's ongoing obsession with persecution suggests an unhealthy environment." Mara rose slowly. "We agree," she said. "And that's why we've submitted Exhibit C." The courtroom screens lit up. Messages, photos, bank records, all linking Nathan's family to months of stalking and harassment. And then a final video. Nathan himself, laughing with his sister about driving Evelyn crazy until she cracks. Silence. Then the judge spoke. "Petition denied. Custody remains with the mother. Supervised visitation, suspended pending further review." Eleanor gasped. Nathan's jaw clenched, and Evelyn, for the first time in years, exhaled without fear. But the story didn't end there, because Evelyn knew what most people don't. Abusers don't disappear when they lose. They adapt. They look for new cracks to exploit. And she refused to let those cracks form again. She moved to a new home, under a sealed address, changed her number, switched jobs, built a fortress around her life, not of walls and locks, but of knowledge, preparation, and community. She taught workshops on digital safety, helped other women recognize the signs of coercive control. She even testified before a state Senate committee about the need for stronger laws. And slowly, painfully, the shadow that Nathan's family had cast over her began to fade. One night, months later, as she tucked Lily into bed, the little girl looked up and asked, "Mummy, are we safe now?" Evelyn paused. She thought of the cameras, the lies, the courtroom battles, the bruises that didn't show, and she realized that safety wasn't a destination. It was a fight, one she was still winning, one day at a time. "Yes," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's forehead. "We're safe, and no one will ever hurt us again." But deep down, Evelyn knew the war wasn't just personal anymore. It was bigger, a war against silence, against systems that failed women like her every day. And as long as there were others still trapped in the dark, she would keep fighting, because her pain was no longer just her own. It was a weapon, a warning, a story that could save someone else before it was too late. And that, she thought as she turned off the light, was a real victory. By the time the third year passed, Evelyn's life looked nothing like the nightmare she had escaped. The new town was quiet, tucked between old trees and quiet streets. The neighbors waved but didn't pry. Lily thrived, happier, louder, freer than Evelyn had ever dared hope. It should have felt like peace. It almost did. But peace has a way of feeling fragile after you've lived too long in fear. And Evelyn could never quite silence the part of her brain that waited for the next blow. She kept cameras, legal ones this time, at every entrance. She scanned every unknown number that called her phone. She read every email twice. Trauma teaches you that vigilance is survival. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Evelyn received a message from an unknown number. It contained a single image, a photo of Lily on the school playground. It wasn't threatening. No words. Just a timestamp and a vantage point that meant someone had been watching. She forwarded it to Mara, who now worked with Evelyn not just as a lawyer, but as part of a larger advocacy group they'd built together. Within hours, they were in contact with law enforcement. A warrant was issued for the account. But as the investigation dragged on, it became clear that whoever was behind it knew how to hide. Still, Evelyn refused to panic. If they were trying to frighten her, they'd fail. Fear was their language, and she no longer spoke it. Instead, she doubled down on her mission. Her blog had become a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting victims of domestic psychological abuse. They funded legal aid, offered digital security training, and ran a hotline staffed entirely by survivors. And when lawmakers proposed the Coercive Control Prevention Act, Evelyn was there, standing in front of cameras, telling her story to the world. Her words resonated far beyond what she expected. Messages flooded in from across the country. Women thanking her, men admitting they hadn't realized their behavior was abusive. Judges and lawyers asking for training materials. Change was slow, but it was happening. And yet, even as the world saw her as a warrior, Evelyn knew the scars beneath the armor. There were still nights when the silence of her house felt too heavy, when every creak sounded like footsteps, when she slept with a flashlight under her pillow. Healing wasn't linear. It was a spiral, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, but always moving. Then, one spring morning, Mara called with news. "They found the source," she said. "The photo, the account. It was linked to a burner phone purchased in Nathan's hometown." Evelyn's breath caught. "Him?" "Not directly. But it's enough to open a new case. And Evelyn, there's something else. The DA is considering criminal charges. Witness intimidation, violation of protective orders, conspiracy. They want you to testify again." The thought of stepping back into a courtroom made Evelyn's stomach knot, but she didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," she said. The trial was uglier than the first. Nathan's lawyers argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They painted Evelyn as obsessed, vindictive, a woman who couldn't move on. But this time, she wasn't alone. Dozens of other survivors testified about similar tactics, all connected to the same private investigator network Nathan's family had used. The case grew from one incident into a systemic exposé of a shadowy, lucrative industry built on intimidation. And when the verdict came, it was decisive. Nathan was convicted of multiple charges, including harassment and conspiracy. Eleanor, too, faced penalties for her involvement. Their influence, once vast and untouchable, was shattered. Evelyn sat in the courtroom as the sentence was read. Prison time, fines, permanent loss of parental rights. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just felt free. Afterward, reporters surrounded her. "Do you feel vindicated?" one asked. She thought for a moment. "No," she said softly. "There's no vindication in this. There's only the knowledge that they can't hurt us anymore." But the case did more than end a chapter of Evelyn's story. It ignited a national conversation. News outlets dissected the trial. Law schools added coercive control to their curriculum. Victims' rights organizations gained funding and influence. And through it all, Evelyn remained at the center. Not as a victim, but as an expert, an advocate, a catalyst for change. It was around this time that she was invited to speak at a major legal conference. The audience was a mix of judges, attorneys, lawmakers, and survivors. As she stepped onto the stage, she felt the weight of every moment that had led her here. The hidden cameras, the courtroom battles, the sleepless nights. "This," she began, her voice steady, "is not just my story. It's a story about power, how it's abused, how it's hidden, and how it can be reclaimed. For years, I was told I was paranoid, unstable, unfit. They tried to erase my reality and replace it with theirs. But reality doesn't disappear just because someone denies it. It waits. It watches. And eventually, it breaks through. She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. What happened to me is happening everywhere. Behind closed doors. In quiet suburbs. In families that look perfect from the outside. Abuse doesn't always leave bruises. Sometimes it leaves doubt. And that's why our laws, our courts, our systems must evolve. Not to punish after the fact, but to prevent before it's too late. The room erupted into applause. And in that moment, Evelyn realized something profound. Her pain had become more than a weapon. It was a bridge, connecting people, shaping policy, rewriting the narrative of what justice could mean. But even as her public life grew larger, her private one remained simple. Mornings with Lily, walks in the park, movie nights on the couch. The ordinary joys she had once taken for granted now felt sacred, and she guarded them fiercely. Still, sometimes, when the house was quiet and the night was long, she'd think about the early days. The fear, the manipulation, the endless gaslighting. And she'd whisper a promise to the woman she used to be. You were right. You were never crazy. And you never deserved any of it. It was a small ritual, but it mattered. Because healing wasn't just about moving on. It was about honoring the part of her that had survived. Then one evening, as she tucked Lily into bed, her daughter asked a question that stopped Evelyn cold. Mom, Lily said, when I grow up, will people believe me if I say someone's hurting me? Evelyn knelt beside the bed, her eyes stinging. Yes, she said, because I'll believe you, and because we're building a world where people listen. It was in that moment Evelyn understood the full scope of her journey. It had never been only about revenge or justice. It had been about breaking a cycle. For Lily, for every woman who came after, for the generations who would inherit a system stronger than the one she had faced. And in that realization, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the fragile kind, always one step from shattering, but a deep, steady peace born from knowing she had turned her pain into something unbreakable. Years later, Evelyn would look back on those chaotic, brutal years as if they belonged to someone else. A different lifetime, a different woman. And in a way, they did. Because the person she had become bore little resemblance to the trembling, gaslit version of herself who once begged to be believed. Now, she was a force, calm, deliberate, and utterly unafraid. Her advocacy work had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. The non-profit she started in her living room had expanded into a national network with chapters in 27 states. Survivors who once whispered their stories in shame now spoke them into microphones at rallies. New laws passed, Evelyn's law among them, strengthening penalties for digital stalking and non-consensual surveillance. She was even invited to testify before Congress. Sitting in that chamber, facing rows of lawmakers and cameras, she felt the weight of thousands of stories on her shoulders. She didn't read from prepared notes. She spoke plainly, directly, the way she wished someone had spoken for her years ago. When someone hides a camera in your home, she told them, they're not trying to protect you. They're trying to erase you. They're building a false version of you, one they can present to courts, to friends, to the world. And if our legal system doesn't understand that, then it's not just failing victims, It's enabling abusers. The hearing ended with a standing ovation, and as she walked out of the Capitol, past flashing cameras and shouted questions, Evelyn didn't feel like a survivor anymore. She felt like an architect, helping design a new reality from the ashes of an old one. But life, even in triumph, remained imperfect. There were still lawsuits to fight, still threats from anonymous accounts, still nights when fear crept in uninvited. Nathan had long since vanished into the prison system, but his family's wealth and resentment meant they never truly disappeared. Rumors surfaced occasionally, attempts to smear her name, to paint her advocacy as anti-family or vindictive. They failed every time, but they reminded Evelyn that victory is rarely final. Still, none of it could touch what mattered most. Lily was thriving, a brilliant, fearless teenager who volunteered at the non-profit on weekends and spoke openly about her childhood experiences. Their bond, once nearly severed by lies and manipulation, had grown unshakable. And Evelyn had built a small circle of trust around them. Friends, fellow survivors, advocates. A family forged not by blood, but by shared battle. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside, Evelyn sat by the fireplace reading over the final draft of her memoir. It had taken years to write, not because she didn't know the story, but because living it again in words had been harder than living it the first time. But now, as she read the last chapter, she felt a sense of completion. Not closure, because trauma doesn't close neatly like a book, but something deeper. Continuity. She dedicated the book not to herself, but to Lily. For the girl who taught me what strength really is. For the woman she will become. Fearless, unbreakable, and free. When the memoir was released, it became a cultural flashpoint. Talk shows debated it. Universities taught it. Survivors carried it like a manifesto. And perhaps most satisfying of all, it was entered into legal evidence in several landmark cases as proof of coercive control patterns. Her story, once nearly erased, had become a weapon in the fight for justice. Months later, Evelyn was invited to speak at an international summit on domestic abuse and digital privacy. The audience included lawmakers from over 40 countries. When she stepped onto the stage, she noticed a woman in the front row holding a copy of her book, its pages worn and dog-eared. After the speech, the woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "You don't know me," she said, "but your story saved my life. I left my husband because of you, and now I'm fighting for custody of my children, and I'm winning." Evelyn hugged her. "Then it was worth it," she whispered. That moment, more than any courtroom victory, any headline, any law, was the true legacy of her fight. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice anymore. It was about planting seeds of resistance in people who thought they were powerless. About showing them that the narrative could be rewritten. And as more stories surfaced, each one echoing hers in its own way, Evelyn realized something profound. Her suffering had not been meaningless. It had become a map for others to escape. Years continued to pass. Lily went to college. Evelyn stepped back from the non-profit, handing the reins to a new generation of advocates. She moved to a small house by the coast. Quiet, isolated, peaceful. She gardened. She wrote. She healed. One summer afternoon, she received a letter from the parole board. Nathan was being released early for good behavior. The news didn't shake her. It barely registered. She was no longer living in reaction to him. He was a ghost, a remnant of a life she'd outgrown. But she still took precautions. Legal orders were renewed, security measures updated. And when reporters asked if she feared his release, she smiled faintly and said, "No, he should fear mine." Because Evelyn was no longer just a survivor of abuse. She was a name in legal textbooks, a voice in legislative chambers, a face on advocacy campaigns. And if Nathan, or anyone like him, tried to repeat the past, they wouldn't just face her. They'd face an entire movement. On the day of his release, Evelyn walked along the shore, the wind whipping her hair, the sea stretching endlessly before her. She felt the weight of everything she had endured. The betrayals, the gaslighting, the cameras, the courtroom battles. And for the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt distant. Like a storm she had once survived, now far behind her. And as the tide rolled in, she whispered to the waves, "I won." But victory wasn't the right word. It wasn't a battle she had won. It was a life she had reclaimed, piece by piece, scar by scar, truth by truth. Her story had begun in silence, in a house filled with hidden cameras and whispered lies. But it ended here, in the open, beneath an endless sky, her voice louder than it had ever been. And for every woman still trapped in the dark, she had one final message. They will call you crazy. They will twist your words and question your memory. They will try to break you. But the truth, your truth, is stronger than their lies. And once you speak it, they cannot control you anymore. Evelyn turned and walked back toward the life she had built, strong, steady, and entirely her own. Because the greatest revenge wasn't in the courtroom or the headlines. It was in living free, fearless, and unafraid. And that, more than anything, was how her story truly ended.